here. It must be sort of it must be fascinating for you to be a person that studies consciousness and you are a conscious person. So it's very interesting. It must be you must be continually up against you are your own experience of you. I was thinking when you said that thing about mystical experiences that there, in a sense, there is nothing but mystical experiences on the basis of, like we've said, the inability to ever truly breach subjectivity and the sort of the privacy of that. And also returning to this idea of power, I sometimes think it's not a coincidence that, or random or arbitrary that these parameters are appearing as to what areas can be explored, i.e. to your point about William James, it's okay to trust sensory experience, but it's not okay to trust mystical experience. And a kind of a determination to keep consciousness in the field, say, of neurology. I think that I suspect and sense and feel that the reason for that is that if we maintain materialism, if we believe only in empiricism, I suppose belief in empiricism is somewhat a contradictory idea, but like if that is how we formulate our values, then I feel that we see where that leads us. It leads us to individualism. It leads us to capitalism. It leads us to, quite literally, to materialism. And yet, on closer examination, we recognise that faith is a component, that there are unaddressed assumptions, and that to reform our society, to reimagine our society, for me, if a component of that is the idea that consciousness is an ever-present and abiding phenomena, I don't want to go into Dreamcatcher and Crystal Land. But I do feel that it's a sort of a very unifying idea. There's something sort of rather beautiful and unifying, and a way of explaining the mystery. And for me, all the mystery is, and all that mysticism is we are briefly interfacing information which we can't yet explain. Like again, did you see that Neil deGrasse Tyson on like the cosmos? I like Neil deGrasse Tyson a lot, and I respect him a great deal. I watched this thing where he talked about that dude called Bruno something or another, who first sort of came up with some stuff, I think prior to Galileo, about like the way that the Earth travels and the sun, and the first person, as I understand at least, to say there are probably multiple solar systems and galaxies, limitless stars, etc. And like he was burned as a heretic or whatever. But in the documentary, Neil deGrasse Tyson explains and he just he didn't have any scientific evidence, he didn't observe this. In fact, the telescope weren't invented for a few more years yet. He just guessed it, or he just dreamed it, or made it up. And I was like, hold on a second, this man accessed this realm of cosmic truth, and that we've dismissed the idea that there are other who are these rishis, these Sufis, these mystics and saints that seem to be able to access data and information that chimes with emerging theories on the nature of reality. I'm not saying it's right to institutionalize them or to start assuming that this group of people are better than this group of people and that particular version of truth is better, but it does at least seem to suggest that there are ways of acquiring data that are not via the senses and enhanced sensory instruments.
Yeah, I mean, another aspect of normal empirical science that I mentioned, which related to that, is the simplicity as a constraint, simplicity and elegance. So actually, for any empirical data, there's always, in principle, an infinite amount of theories, hypotheses compatible with it. How do we choose between them? On the basis of simplicity. But why the hell are simpler theories more likely to be true? That's not, that's a kind of weird starting point of science. And usually it's kind of obvious what the simplest theory is. But I mean, sometimes mere simplicity has been a crucial decision point. So with special relativity, Einstein's theory of special relativity was empirically equivalent to the Lorentzian theory that preceded it. It's just that Einstein gave a much simpler and more elegant interpretation of the data, and Lorentz had all these ad hoc constraints. So, that is another aspect where we're not just, people sometimes have this oversimplistic conception of science, like it's just reading the data and putting the results. But sometimes it involves, leaps of the imagination, radical reconceptualizations of our understanding of the universe. And coming back to the point about power and societal implications. So there's a strain of feminist thought. Naomi Klein's talked about this, that this moment in the scientific revolution where we separate out quantitative physical world and qualitative consciousnesses, leads to the idea that the natural world is a mechanism, and leads to the idea that we can do what the hell we want with it.
Yeah.
Moving on from a sort of maybe pagan idea of, Mother Earth as something that needs respect and even fear. So I think, I'm trying to think, I talk about this in the final chapter of my book, that the first 4 chapters are the sort of philosophical scientific case, and then the final chapter is just discussing the implications for human existence. And I do think, it could potentially lead to a better relationship with the environment. If you think a tree is just a mechanism, then basically you think its value is to do with indirect, what it can do for us, either by looking pretty or sustaining our existence. But if you think a tree is a conscious organism, albeit of a very alien kind, then it's a locus of moral value in its own right. Chopping down a tree is an act of moral significance. So these terrible forest fires we've seen in Brazil, we're all horrified by them, but if you see that as the burning of conscious organisms, it adds a whole moral dimension. So I kind of speculate about a child raised in a panpsychist worldview seeing a forest as a buzzing, blooming community. I think can give you a very different connection to nature. Although I've been trying to persuade my 3-year-old, saying, do you think trees have feelings? And she said, no, they're just outside, they don't think about anything. So
yeah, I've got a 3-year-old and a 2-year-old, and they're conservative, selfish little bastards.
Yeah,
in the main.
property
Hey,
is so hardwired into toddlers.
Property, ego, I'll kill you. Yeah, like that thing that you just said about the sort of preference for simplicity in the establishment of hypotheses and theories. That's an interesting and fundamental bias that's kind of about aesthetics more than anything else. And the other challenge that I feel that conventional science faces is on the assumption of objectivity is the way that it is funded, the kind of questions that are asked, the kind of questions that are not asked. And to your later point about like if kids grew up thinking that they are inherently connected to trees, that themselves are conscious organisms a priori, then it's not so easy to breed generation after generation, which you point out is sort of almost an anomalous historical blip, to raise people just to consume stuff and not think about anything else. You're an individual, the tree's just a mechanism, chuck that down, use it. If it's not useful to you, it's not valuable. That's for me not an accidental worldview, but a deliberate one that feeds into a particular and fundamental philosophy that is our abiding one, that for utility, economics. If it can't be used, it's not of value.
Yeah, and I think touching on, connecting to this, the fear of you. People worry if we're going to take these approaches, we're going to lose all constraint. You're going to lose the way of, you're going to get to the woo and the mystery. But as I say, I think we've got academic institutions, we've got peer review system to weed that out and to bring rigor. And it's more important than ever, I think, to avoid conflicts of interest. I was just speaking at a philosophy festival, and also speaking there was Mark Littlewood from the Institute of Economic Affairs, who, an organization who don't declare their funders. And so, don't give us the right to listen to what they're saying, and in the knowledge of who's paying the piper, so I don't, and they're on the BBC all the time as sort of impartial voices. I think you should not have the right to, call yourself a think tank unless you are completely transparent as your donors. You shouldn't have the right to appear on the BBC as, so I think I think the answer to this worry about losing any kind of constraint is, institutions where we get out conflicts of interest, we have transparency, and I think that's an important part of it.
I agree. I think it's a kind of conservatism as opposed to some sort of like preservation of some pure ideal, that when you have funded organisations presenting information as unbiased truth, that's problematic. Again, it's like that is ideological. It's deeply ideological.